At 9:17 on the morning of the 7th of December, 1941, Commander Minoru Genda stood on the vast, wind-swept flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi. 230 miles north of Oahu, the sun was still low on the horizon. The icy air bit against the exposed steel. Above him, the last formations of the second attack wave dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters diminished into the southern sky, racing toward Pearl Harbor at nearly 200 knots. As the engines faded, a deep and unnatural stillness settled across the deck. Genda, architect of the Pearl Harbor strike, allowed himself a moment to absorb the significance of what was unfolding. 11 months of planning, of calculation, of rehearsing every detail down to the angle of the approach vectors had led to this moment. He believed, as did most of the Japanese high command, that this attack could change the course of the war before it even truly began. Strike hard, cripple the American Pacific Fleet, and force Washington to negotiate from weakness. That was the theory. And on the surface, nothing seemed to contradict it. But beneath the orderly confidence of the Japanese officers aboard Akagi lay an intelligence error so vast, so catastrophic, that it had already predetermined the final outcome of the war before a single American ship was struck, before a single bomb was dropped on Battleship Row. The tragedy was simple. Japan fundamentally misunderstood the scale of American naval manpower. Tokyo believed that by December 1943, the U.S. Navy would field 296,000 sailors and officers. The actual number on that date was 2,374,094, a miscalculation of almost 8 to 1. This was not a clerical mistake or a flaw in arithmetic. It was a systemic failure rooted in cultural assumptions, institutional blind spots, and an inability to imagine an enemy fundamentally different from themselves. And it meant Japan had entered a war it could not possibly win, no matter how brilliantly its officers fought, no matter how courageously its sailors served. To understand how such a colossal misjudgment occurred, one must return to the foundations of Japanese intelligence work in the 1932nd and early 1940s. The Imperial Japanese Navy was an elite institution built on professionalism, discipline, and technical mastery. But it was also rigid, hierarchical, and resistant to internal criticism. Intelligence work, so critical in modern warfare, was viewed not as a prestigious assignment, but as a peripheral administrative duty. Combat command, not intelligence analysis, was the path to honor and promotion. This mindset shaped every assumption Japan made about the United States. When officers in Tokyo studied the American Navy, they saw not the actual institution but a reflection of themselves, a mirror image constructed from Japanese logic, Japanese culture, and Japanese standards. They assumed Americans thought like Japanese officers, trained like Japanese officers, mobilized like Japanese officers, and because the Imperial Navy prided itself on lean, efficient crews and careful long-term training, they assumed the Americans would expand slowly and methodically. They made the single greatest mistake an intelligence service can make. They assumed the enemy was just like them. Mirror imaging, as modern analysts call it, blinded Japan to the true nature of the United States. America was a continental industrial superpower with a population of 131 million, a vast middle class, a culture accustomed to rapid production, and an economy that dwarfed Japan's by orders of magnitude. The United States could mobilize faster, train faster, and build faster than any nation Japan had ever faced. Yet Japanese analysts believed firmly, confidently, that America's Navy would grow at the same steady pace as their own. Ensign Takeo Yoshikawa, the undercover intelligence officer sent to Honolulu in 1941, exemplifies the tragedy of this miscalculation. Yoshikawa was brilliant. He memorized ship movements, studied patrol patterns, observed airfields, and produced detailed reports with precision unmatched by most of his counterparts. His intelligence was accurate, timely, and thorough. The problem was not what he saw, but what Tokyo assumed about what he saw. When Yoshikawa counted battleships, Tokyo calculated crew sizes using Japanese standards. A Japanese battleship operated with a carefully optimized crew, trained over years of service. The Americans, they believed, surely followed the same logic. They assumed American shipyards and training bases were constrained by similar manpower limitations. They were wrong, spectacularly wrong. By the time Yoshikawa sent his last pre-attack report, the U.S. Navy already had over 284,000 personnel and was accelerating training programs across the country. Boot camps were expanding, technical schools were multiplying, civilians were volunteering in unprecedented numbers. American industrial mobilization had begun months before Pearl Harbor, and it was accelerating faster than any Japanese model had predicted. But the Imperial Navy had no framework for understanding exponential growth. Their own navy had taken decades to reach its pre-war strength of roughly 120,000 officers and sailors. Their culture taught that creating an effective navy required patience, meticulous training, and stability. They believed the United States would face the same constraints. Meanwhile, America was preparing to grow from 284,000 personnel in mid-1941 to more than 1.6 million by the end of 1942, an explosive expansion Japan literally could not imagine. On Akagi that morning, none of this was visible to Genda and his fellow officers. All they knew were the numbers Tokyo had given them. According to those numbers, America was a giant with considerable industrial power, but limited ability to generate trained sailors in sufficient quantities to sustain prolonged conflict. In the war plans circulated among top Japanese leadership, the United States was expected to fight a slow, measured, narrow-front war restricted by manpower, reliant on conservative deployments, and unwilling to sustain major losses. Japan believed that if it struck quickly, seized resource-rich territories, and fortified a defensive perimeter across the Pacific, the U.S. Navy would be unable to mount simultaneous offensives. The Americans, they assumed, would be forced to pick their battles carefully, and Japan intended to destroy them piecemeal as they advanced. Every part of the Japanese strategy, the seizure of the Dutch East Indies, the push into Southeast Asia, the attempted control of the Central Pacific relied on one core assumption, that America lacked the personnel to sustain a long, multi-theater war. But Japan was preparing for a war against the wrong enemy. Their intelligence models described an America that was slow, methodical, and limited. The real America was something entirely different. A nation capable of mobilizing millions, training them rapidly, and sending them across 2 oceans without hesitation. The most painful irony is that the information Japan needed was not secret. It was not hidden, encrypted, or impossible to discover. Much of it was published openly in American industrial reports, census data, congressional hearings, and naval journals. Japan did not lack data. It lacked interpretation. Intelligence officers collected information, but operational planners filtered it through cultural assumptions that rendered the raw numbers meaningless. Japan saw the facts, but not their significance. This blindness was not a failure of one officer, nor one department, nor one report. It was systemic, institutional, strategic. The Imperial Navy could not imagine an enemy capable of scaling personnel from hundreds of thousands to millions in a period shorter than the Japanese required to train a single cohort of specialist sailors. So, on that cold December morning, as Genda watched the aircraft vanish into the southern sky, he believed honestly, sincerely, that Japan was about to seize control of the Pacific. He believed the Americans would fight hard, but slowly. He believed he understood the enemy's weakness. He believed the war could be decided quickly, before American strength was fully realized. But the war, though nobody on Akagi yet knew, it had already been decided. The miscalculation of American manpower was not simply an error. It was the decisive factor that determined the fate of the Pacific War before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. In March 1941, 9 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, a slender, soft-spoken naval officer stepped off a passenger ship in Honolulu wearing civilian clothes and carrying a diplomatic passport. His name was Takeo Yoshikawa, though the papers identified him as Tadashi Morimura. To the American public, he appeared to be another minor official assigned to the Japanese consulate. To the Imperial Navy, he was one of the most important intelligence operatives in the Pacific, Japan's eyes and ears, in the heart of the U.S. Pacific Fleet's forward base. Yoshikawa had never intended to become a spy. He had once been a promising naval aviator, quick in the cockpit and gifted with a photographic memory. But a debilitating stomach illness ended his flying career. Unable to serve in the air, he was reassigned to naval intelligence. There, his sharp memory and analytical mind quickly distinguished him. By early 1941, he was chosen for Japan's most sensitive overseas mission: assess American naval activity in Hawaii and provide Tokyo with near real-time visibility on the U.S. fleet. Yoshikawa embraced the assignment with meticulous dedication. He studied the terrain, memorized ship silhouettes, and learned how to interpret American naval routines. He took the public tour boat through Pearl Harbor repeatedly, committing the geometry of Battleship Row to memory. He posed as a tourist while sketching dry docks and fuel depots. He rented civilian aircraft to fly over Oahu, carefully observing airfields and hangars. He memorized patrol schedules, counted aircraft, and logged every ship entering or leaving the harbor. His reporting was thorough, detailed, and accurate. But accuracy alone was not enough. The tragedy of Japanese intelligence was not that Yoshikawa failed to gather information. It was that the entire system failed to interpret his intelligence correctly. Tokyo received his dispatches with appreciation, then filtered the data through pre-existing assumptions that distorted everything. For every battleship Yoshikawa documented, Tokyo calculated a Japanese-style crew. For every aircraft he counted, Tokyo assumed Japanese maintenance requirements. For every base expansion he noted, Tokyo inferred Japanese estimates of manpower needs. To Japanese planners, data was useful only to the extent that it could be mapped onto their own worldview. And their worldview was rigid. Japanese warships operated with lean manpower. Carrier crew sizes were optimized for efficiency. Training pipelines were long, disciplined, and arduous. It could take years to shape a skilled sailor. Aircrew development was even slower. Every pilot represented a significant investment in time and resources. Japan's naval doctrine had been shaped around elite professionalism rather than mass mobilization. Therefore, Japanese intelligence assumed the Americans were doing the same. This assumption, simple, untested, and deeply flawed, became the foundation of their entire strategic picture, and it would destroy them. The Imperial Japanese Navy possessed a highly competent operations staff. Its officers were brave, disciplined, and technically skilled. But when it came to intelligence, the institutional culture was profoundly flawed. Intelligence was seen as support, not strategy. Intelligence officers were expected to provide information, not challenge the conclusions that admirals already believed. The structure discouraged dissent. Young analysts who produced estimates that contradicted operational assumptions were dismissed as inexperienced or overly cautious. Senior analysts who contradicted the prevailing narrative risked their careers. Intelligence, in the Japanese system, was molded to fit strategy, not the other way around. Some officers later admitted that analyses were often judged not by accuracy but by whether they reinforced existing war plans. In such an environment, mistakes were not corrected. They were institutionalized. Tokyo had access to immense amounts of information. They received diplomatic reports from Washington. They read American technical journals. Japanese merchant sailors regularly visited West Coast ports and returned with descriptions of shipyards and naval bases. They collected congressional records, census statistics, and labor reports, all publicly available. But raw information is not understanding, and understanding requires the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. Japanese planners could not conceive that America would train tens of thousands of recruits monthly. They could not imagine that civilians could be turned into sailors quickly and effectively. They could not grasp that America's industrial culture, fast, flexible, decentralized, entrepreneurial, made possible a scale of naval expansion beyond anything Japan had ever considered. Thus, even the most accurate intelligence reports were interpreted through the conservative lens of Japanese naval tradition. As one post-war analyst later wrote, Japan gathered intelligence well but interpreted it poorly. Nowhere was this clearer than in the data regarding American training capacity. American naval boot camps were not small, elite academies like their Japanese counterparts. They were vast, industrial-scale training complexes with barracks, cafeterias, drill fields, classrooms, machine shops, weapons ranges, and medical facilities capable of processing massive numbers. Recruit training could be completed in 8 weeks. Technical school followed immediately. The system was designed for throughput, maximum numbers, and minimum time without sacrificing basic proficiency. Japan knew this. They had reports, they had data, they had eyewitness accounts, but they dismissed it all. "It is impossible," one Japanese staff officer wrote in 1941, "for the Americans to train sailors so quickly. Combat effectiveness requires long preparation. Their numbers must be exaggerated." The truth was the opposite. America's training model was built on scale, not exclusivity. The United States did not attempt to create perfect sailors. It created effective ones quickly, efficiently, and in staggering numbers. Inside Tokyo's Naval General Staff Building, the Intelligence Division struggled under immense pressure and low prestige. They were overworked, understaffed, and expected to support rather than question. Their warnings when they issued them carried little weight. A recurring problem was the dominance of the operations section, staffed by officers destined for high command. Whenever intelligence estimates contradicted operational plans, the operations section simply overruled them. After all, operations officers were the rising stars of the Navy. Intelligence was the backroom. This imbalance had a direct impact on war planning. When intelligence suggested American naval strength was growing faster than expected, planners dismissed it as an anomaly. When data indicated the U.S. might eventually field far more ships than Japan could counter, it was ignored. When analysts warned of exponential rather than linear growth, they were told they misunderstood the nature of American training. Japan's intelligence system was structurally incapable of challenging assumptions at the highest levels. It could collect facts, but it could not accept their implications. Meanwhile, back in Honolulu, Yoshikawa continued to report on American ship movements with almost obsessive precision. He memorized hull numbers, counted aircraft squadrons, estimated fuel consumption from smoke coloration, and even tracked submarine departures. His reports were accurate enough that Genda used them directly in planning the Pearl Harbor attack. But in Tokyo, the data was forced into a predetermined mold. Even the best intelligence could not correct the fundamental conceptual error. Japan believed it was fighting a navy that resembled its own. In reality, the United States Navy was evolving into something unprecedented in modern history, a global, industrial-scale force capable of flooding the Pacific with ships, aircraft, and men faster than its enemies could destroy them. Japan's inability to grasp this transformation was not just an oversight, it was a strategic blindness, a cultural constraint, an institutional limitation, and it meant that every Japanese war plan was built on faulty assumptions about American manpower. By late 1941, Tokyo was convinced it fully understood the U.S. Navy. They believed they knew how many ships America had, how many sailors manned those ships, and how quickly the U.S. could mobilize in wartime. They believed their intelligence picture was complete, but the reality was far more dangerous. Japan did not understand the United States, not its culture, not its industry, not its mobilization capacity. They had the numbers, but not the meaning. They saw the ships, but not the scale. They read the reports, but ignored the implications. And as a result, they entered a war confident in a strategy that the true strength of the American Navy had already rendered obsolete. This was the quiet disaster at the heart of Japanese intelligence, a system that saw everything, understood nothing, and told leaders exactly what they expected to hear. In the first half of the 20th century, the Imperial Japanese Navy was one of the most professional and elite naval forces on Earth. Its officers trained under exacting standards, its sailors drilled relentlessly, and its aviators, especially its carrier pilots, were considered among the most skilled in the world. The institution prided itself on precision, discipline, and a relentless pursuit of technical and tactical excellence. Yet buried deep within this culture of mastery was a fatal flaw, a fundamental inability to imagine a world where other nations operated by rules different from Japan's own. This flaw, subtle, invisible, and deeply embedded, was known as mirror imaging, the assumption that the enemy thinks, values, organizes, trains, and mobilizes exactly as you do. It is one of the oldest and most dangerous traps in intelligence analysis, and in Japan's case, it would become the silent architect of strategic catastrophe. The Imperial Navy believed that creating an effective fighting force required time, years of disciplined training, years of cultivating cohesion, years of gradual development. Japanese sailors typically entered the naval system young and were shaped from adolescence through rigid routines, physical conditioning, moral instruction, and technical training. The process was slow because it was designed for excellence, not speed. Thus, Japanese naval leaders expected the U.S. Navy to follow the same path. If it took Japan years to produce a skilled sailor, then surely it took America years as well. If Japan considered mass mobilization incompatible with naval professionalism, then surely America must feel the same. If Japan viewed reserve forces as inherently inferior, then surely America, an even more technologically advanced Navy, must avoid them too. These assumptions were never questioned because, within the Japanese worldview, they made perfect sense. But they were catastrophically wrong. To understand the scale of this misunderstanding, one must first understand what the Imperial Navy valued most. At its core, the Japanese naval ethos emphasized perfect execution over rapid expansion, elite craftsmanship over mass production, highly trained specialists over large numbers of generalists, quality over quantity in every dimension. This philosophy produced superb pilots, exceptional gunnery crews, and disciplined shipboard teams. But it also produced a blindness toward the concept of strategic scale. Japan came from an island nation with limited industrial capacity, limited natural resources, and a population half the size of the United States. Its entire naval tradition was shaped by scarcity. A single battleship crew might take years to develop. A single air group could require hundreds of thousands of man-hours of training. Aircraft maintenance specialists underwent education that rivaled technical universities. Japan built its navy like a craftsman carving intricate woodwork, slow, deliberate, highly specialized. By contrast, the United States built its navy like a factory, fast, scalable, systematic, and industrial. This cultural divide produced devastating miscalculations. In 1941, Japanese planners believed that America would struggle to mobilize even a few 100,000 sailors. They assumed that training limitations would prevent rapid expansion. They assumed that replacing losses, especially pilots, would take years. They assumed that mass conscription would degrade effectiveness. They assumed that American sailors would require long integration periods before achieving combat proficiency. All of these assumptions were logical from the perspective of Japanese naval tradition, but none of them were true. The United States had designed its military to mobilize at industrial scale. Boot camps trained thousands simultaneously. Technical schools were modular and standardized. Reserve programs had existed for decades, and the American mindset, pragmatic, flexible, and production-oriented, embraced the idea of turning civilians into sailors with unprecedented speed. To Japan, such rapid training seemed impossible. To America, it was simply engineering. The Imperial Navy did not merely underestimate America's training capacity. It failed to understand the cultural engine behind American mobilization. American society in 1941 was built on mass production, standardized procedures, and decentralized initiative. The workforce was accustomed to large-scale operations, assembly lines, production quotas, shift work, and rapid conversion of civilian facilities into war industries. American educational institutions were designed to deliver technical skills quickly. Civilian industries regularly retrained workers for new manufacturing techniques. Efficiency was worshipped, speed was expected, scale was routine. Japan had no equivalent context to compare this with. In Japanese culture, mastery was typically slow and artisanal. America treated mastery as something that could be industrially replicated. Thus, when Japanese analysts saw American training facilities capable of processing thousands of recruits simultaneously, they simply didn't believe what they were seeing. Reports that contradicted Japanese assumptions were considered exaggerations. Prisoner interviews suggesting massive training output were dismissed. American publications describing large-scale mobilization were read but interpreted through Japanese logic. The result was a layered misunderstanding. Japan collected accurate data, but its cultural framework prevented it from interpreting that data correctly. Mirror imaging also affected Japan's perception of American willpower. Japanese doctrine emphasized spiritual fortitude and moral purity, qualities they believed distinguished them from the West. The concept of Yamato Damashi, the Japanese warrior spirit, permeated every corner of naval culture. Japanese officers believed deeply in the moral superiority of their fighting tradition. Thus, they assumed Americans lacked the resolve for prolonged warfare. They believed the United States would not sustain heavy casualties. They believed the American public would demand peace after early losses. They believed that, faced with a bloody and grinding conflict, American politicians would eventually seek negotiation rather than escalation. All of these assumptions, every single one, was wrong. America would go on to fight one of the largest, most devastating wars in its history with total national commitment. Yet, Japanese planners entered the conflict convinced that American morale was fragile. They thought the United States would tire long before Japan exhausted its own reserves of courage. Mirror imaging once again blinded them. Japan expected America to quit because Japan believed America valued comfort more than victory. But America valued victory more than Japan could comprehend. The consequences of this cultural blindness became evident as soon as the war began. When American shipyards increased their production capacity tenfold in less than 2 years, Japan had no conceptual model to explain how such expansion was possible. When American training camps produced hundreds of thousands of sailors, Japan believed the numbers were false. When American carriers survived damage that would have sunk Japanese ships, they assumed American crews were simply lucky rather than analyzing the impact of expanded damage control teams. Mirror imaging turned every American success into an anomaly rather than evidence of a fundamentally different system. Instead of adjusting their assumptions, Japanese planners interpreted American strength as inefficiency. Instead of seeing American logistics as a superpower advantage, they saw wastefulness. Instead of recognizing a mobilization miracle, they saw disorganized overstaffing. The Japanese mindset was so deeply rooted in its own cultural assumptions that it could not grasp the true scale of the American war machine. By late 1942, even as American forces surged across the Pacific, few Japanese officers realized the magnitude of their misunderstanding. Reports continued to arrive, showing rapid American expansion. Data accumulated, showing increasing manpower. Observations confirmed growing naval strength, but mirror imaging prevented Japan from seeing the truth. They saw the American Navy. They counted the ships. They intercepted the communications. They watched the convoys. They observed the airfields. They interrogated the prisoners, yet they interpreted everything through the same flawed cultural lens. Japan believed it understood the enemy. In reality, Japan understood only a distorted reflection of itself, and that illusion, powerful, persistent, and tragically convincing, ensured that the Pacific War would unfold under the shadow of a fatal misjudgment. Japan did not lose the war because it fought poorly. It lost because it misunderstood who it was fighting. War has a way of revealing truths that peacetime illusions can conceal. For Japan, the early months of the Pacific War were filled with triumphs. Singapore, the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies. Each victory convinced Tokyo that its pre-war assumptions had been correct. Each success reinforced the belief that America was slow to mobilize, limited in manpower, and incapable of sustaining a prolonged, multi-front conflict. But beneath the surface of these early victories, cracks were already spreading through Japan's strategic worldview. 3 battles, Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal, offered Japan unmistakable evidence that its intelligence assumptions were wrong. These battles did not simply mark turning points in the war, they exposed a deeper truth. Japan had misjudged the United States at the most fundamental level, yet even as the evidence mounted, Japanese planners dismissed the warnings. They saw anomalies, exceptions, or lucky coincidences, anything except the truth staring back at them. The tragedy was not that the warnings were invisible. The tragedy was that they were ignored. Coral Sea was a strange battle fought almost entirely by aircraft, with ships never sighting one another. It was also the first time Japanese intelligence received a shock they could not easily explain. Prior to the battle, Japanese planners believed that 2 American aircraft carriers could field roughly 4,000 sailors based on Japanese manning standards. A Japanese carrier, after all, operated with lean, tightly trained crews. They assumed the Americans followed the same model. But in the days leading up to Coral Sea, Japanese radio intercept specialists made a disturbing discovery. Monitoring American transmissions, they detected multiple task group commanders issuing orders, additional logistics, ships coordinating movements, and destroyer screens far larger than expected. The entire operation appeared unusually dense with personnel, signals, and support ships. The numbers didn't add up. After-action assessments estimated that the Americans had between 7,000 and 9,000 personnel in the operational area, nearly double the Japanese estimate for 2 carriers. This should have been an alarm. Instead, it was rationalized away. Perhaps the Americans were inexperienced. Perhaps they relied on redundant systems. Perhaps they simply overstaffed their ships. The idea that American carriers actually required larger crews because they were more technologically complex or because they had vastly more trained personnel available never crossed the minds of most Japanese planners. Mirror imaging once again shaped interpretation. The Japanese saw inefficiency where they should have seen scale. Midway was more than a defeat. It was a revelation, one so profound that it should have shattered Japan's entire strategic framework. On June 4, U.S. Navy dive bombers struck 3 Japanese carriers in rapid succession, igniting fuel stores and crippling the heart of Japan's offensive air power. But even as Japanese officers reeled from the tactical disaster, an even more disturbing phenomenon unfolded: the survival of the American carrier Yorktown. From the Japanese perspective, Yorktown's endurance defied logic. The ship had already been damaged at Coral Sea. Japanese planners assumed it would take months to repair. Instead, the Americans restored it in 72 hours, patched it sufficiently for combat, and sailed it into one of the most decisive battles of the war. During the battle, Yorktown absorbed 3 bomb hits, 1 torpedo strike, a second torpedo strike hours later, and massive internal damage. Based on Japanese understanding, such damage was unrecoverable. A Japanese carrier hit in that manner would have been abandoned. But the Americans had something Japan lacked entirely: large, trained, redundant damage. Control teams, where Japan assigned a small number of elite specialists, America assigned dozens, sometimes hundreds of sailors trained specifically for firefighting, patching ruptures, restoring power, and improvising repairs under extreme conditions. Yorktown went from dead in the water to making 20 knots within hours. Her flight deck was repaired with steel patches. Pumping systems were restored. Fires were extinguished with shocking speed. And when Japanese officers later recovered Yorktown's crew list from floating debris, they discovered something even more alarming. Yorktown carried more than 2,200 crew members, nearly 50% more than Japanese estimates. This single document should have forced a re-examination of all manpower assumptions. Instead, it was quietly catalogued and dismissed as an exception, another anomaly in a war that should have been predictable. If Coral Sea hinted at the problem and Midway illuminated it, Guadalcanal screamed it from the mountaintops. Japanese planners believed that American manpower limitations would restrict U.S. forces in the South Pacific. They estimated the Americans could land 8,000 to 10,000 troops at most. The reality, 11,000 Marines landed on Guadalcanal on the first day. Additional units landed on Tulagi and nearby islands. The total initial force exceeded 16,000 personnel. This alone contradicted Japanese expectations. But what came next was worse. The U.S. Navy deployed 3 aircraft carriers, a battleship, 14 cruisers, 31 destroyer, and a vast fleet of supply and transport ships. The personnel required to operate this force exceeded 30,000 sailors, not counting the thousands of merchant mariners transporting supplies. Japanese submarines patrolling the approaches to Guadalcanal observed an astonishing phenomenon. American convoys were continuous, flowing with a volume Japan believed impossible. Japan assumed the Americans had fewer than 400,000 naval personnel in total, yet U.S. forces were conducting a major offensive in the Solomon Islands, while simultaneously maintaining Atlantic convoy escorts, supporting Operation Torch in North Africa, building new fleets on both coasts, and training hundreds of thousands of new recruits. The math was impossible, or rather, it was impossible by Japanese logic. Instead of concluding that their intelligence estimates were wrong, Tokyo assumed the Americans were overextended and on the brink of collapse. They waited for America to break. They waited for fatigue, resource limits, or logistical strain. None came. The Americans weren't straining. They were accelerating. Japan's strategic culture made it psychologically difficult, almost impossible to accept that the enemy was stronger than expected. After years of victories in China and early triumphs in the Pacific, the idea that American manpower could dwarf Japan's seemed absurd, almost humiliating. 3 forces prevented honest reassessment. 1. Cultural pride. Admitting the Americans were capable of rapid, mass mobilization undermined Japanese beliefs about their own superiority. Pride-blinded analysis. 2. Institutional hierarchy. Intelligence officers who challenged operational expectations risked their careers. It was safer to interpret data in a way that reinforced existing plans. 3. Confirmation bias. Every early victory validated pre-war assumptions. Losses were explained away as tactical failures, not strategic impossibilities. And so, Japan entered mid-1943, still believing that the Americans were approaching their manpower limits, even as U.S. naval personnel surpassed 1.6 million and continued to grow. Coral Sea showed the Americans had more personnel than expected. Midway proved they had more resilience than expected. Guadalcanal revealed they had more manpower than expected. Together, these battles presented overwhelming evidence that America's naval strength was not what Japan believed. It was far, far greater. Yet the Imperial Navy clung to its pre-war assumptions like a lifeline. They saw the facts. They read the reports. They listened to the warnings, but they refused to believe them. Japan was fighting an enemy of unimaginable scale, and because they could not imagine it, they could not prepare for it. The Pacific War was not lost at Pearl Harbor. It was lost in the months that followed, when Japan chose belief over evidence, doctrine over data, pride over truth. By early 1943, the Pacific Ocean had become a vast laboratory of intelligence. Every convoy sighted, every radio signal intercepted, every captured document, and every prisoner interrogated carried fragments of a larger truth, one Japan had never intended to confront. Though Tokyo's pre-war assumptions still dominated official thinking, reality was slipping through the cracks, forcing itself into the view of officers who could no longer avoid the question, how many men did the United States truly have? This question, whispered quietly in the halls of the Naval Staff College, echoed in mess rooms, and murmured in intelligence offices across Tokyo, threatened the foundations of Japan's war strategy. The problem was no longer a shortage of information. On the contrary, there was too much of it, and all of it pointed in the same alarming direction. The United States Navy was expanding at a pace Japan had considered not only improbable, but physically impossible. Yet still, the Japanese system resisted. It did not want to believe. As Japanese units clashed with American forces across the Solomon Islands, field commanders began reporting numbers that contradicted Tokyo's intelligence models. During air battles over Guadalcanal, Japanese pilots noticed something unsettling. American aircraft losses were being replaced faster than Japan could shoot them down. One pilot famously said after returning from a mission, "For every plane we destroy, 2 more take its place." Similar patterns emerged at sea. Japanese submarines stalking the supply lines around Guadalcanal recorded enormous flows of American logistics, transport ships, oilers, freighters, destroyer escorts, all moving with a consistency Japan could not match. These reports landed on desks in Tokyo, creating waves of unease. If American personnel were truly limited, as pre-war estimates insisted, then where were all these ships coming from? Where were the men trained to crew them? And how were these task forces simultaneously operating in both the Atlantic and the Pacific? The math did not add up. But Tokyo told itself the same comforting lie. The Americans must be overextended. Surely they were operating at their limit. Surely a breaking point was near. But the breaking point never came. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, was the first senior officer willing to confront the truth. Having studied at Harvard, lived in the United States, and toured American industrial centers, Yamamoto understood the scale of U.S. power in a way most Japanese officers could not. Unlike many of his colleagues, he had seen Detroit's factories, California's shipyards, and the vast inland rail networks that could move the resources of a continent. In early 1943, Yamamoto sent a direct cable to Naval General Staff Headquarters. His message was unusually blunt. The American naval presence in the Pacific had grown to levels impossible under existing intelligence estimates. Therefore, the estimates must be wrong. Yamamoto's warning hit Tokyo like a cold gust of wind, but even his authority could not shake deeply entrenched beliefs. Some officers argued that the Americans had stripped the Atlantic bare. Others insisted American crews were inflated with unnecessary personnel. A few claimed the Americans were bluffing, using dummy signals to feign a larger presence. But the real answer, the one Yamamoto had grasped, was far simpler. Japan had underestimated American manpower by a factor no one wanted to accept. In July 1943, a young American sailor was pulled from the waters near Kolombangara after his destroyer was sunk during a brutal night engagement. He was exhausted, shaken, but unexpectedly talkative. Japanese interrogation officers, accustomed to the silence of captured Japanese sailors, were surprised by his openness. The cultural differences were stark. Japanese servicemen believed in death before dishonor. Americans believed captivity was unfortunate but survivable. During the interrogation, the sailor began describing his training experience. He had graduated from the Great Lakes Naval Training Station, one of America's major naval boot camps. He talked casually about the massive scale of the facility, rows upon rows of barracks, mess halls that served thousands at a time, endless drill fields, classrooms, and firing ranges. Then he said something that stunned his interrogator. His training company alone had 4,000 recruits, and the base processed 20,000 new sailors every month. The interrogator froze. He asked the sailor to repeat the figure. 20,000 per month? From a single facility? The number seemed impossible, even absurd. Japan could barely train that many naval personnel in a year. The sailor then added, almost casually, "There are 3 other training bases around the country doing the same thing." The interrogator wrote the figure in his report, 480,000 potential new sailors per year, but noted that the prisoner was probably exaggerating. Tokyo treated the report as interesting but unreliable. Reality had spoken clearly, and Japan refused to listen. In September 1943, confirmation arrived from an unexpected place. Germany. A German U-boat commander, operating in the North Atlantic, had encountered American destroyer escorts during a nighttime engagement. His after-action report included technical observations. American ships carried 50% more crew than similar German vessels. Crew positions indicated far more redundancy. Multiple damage control teams swarmed to fire simultaneously. Berlin shared the report with Tokyo through routine Axis intelligence channels. For Japanese analysts, this was a revelation. Germany, Japan's technologically sophisticated ally, had independently observed the same phenomenon Japan had been dismissing for months. American ships weren't overmanned. They weren't inefficient. They weren't using unnecessary personnel. They were applying a different naval philosophy, one built for industrial-scale warfare. Alarmed by Yamamoto's warning, prisoner reports, German confirmations, and submarine sightings, the Naval Intelligence Division initiated a full review. A team of seasoned analysts was assembled with a clear directive: recalculate U.S. naval personnel strength from scratch. They gathered every piece of information available: radio intercepts, submarine sightings, captured documents, POW interrogation reports, German intelligence, American technical journals, observed ship manning levels, training base estimates. Piece by piece, they rebuilt the picture. The results were staggering. Minimum estimate: 850. 000. Likely estimate: 1,200,000. Upper range estimate: 1,800. 000. These numbers dwarfed the original estimate of 296,000. Yet, even these revised calculations were still below reality. By December 1943, the actual number was 2,374,094. This meant Japan had been fighting an enemy nearly 8 times larger than expected. The new intelligence report, completed after 6 weeks of exhaustive analysis, was delivered to Tokyo in November 1943. It was sobering, methodical, and undeniable. Japan had completely misjudged American manpower. The report concluded that the U.S. could operate multiple major fleets simultaneously. Losses would not significantly slow American operations. The Pacific War could not be won through attrition. Japan's defensive perimeter strategy was obsolete. American production capacity rendered decisive battle irrelevant. For the officers who read it, the implications were devastating. Every Japanese campaign plan from 1941 onward had been built on a false foundation. Yet, instead of prompting strategic change, the truth was buried. The findings were restricted to fewer than 20 senior officers. Operational planners continued using outdated manpower assumptions. Field commanders were told nothing. The institutional system simply could not absorb the truth without collapsing. By late 1943, Japan had all the evidence it needed: radio intercepts, prisoner testimony, German confirmation, field reports, ship sightings, and revised manpower calculations. The conclusion was clear. Japan was fighting a war it could not win. The United States was not overextended. It was not approaching its manpower limit. It was not slowing down. It was accelerating, growing stronger, larger, and more unstoppable with every passing month. But Japan's political and military leadership, bound by pride, culture, and institutional rigidity, chose denial over adaptation. The war would continue, the sacrifices would multiply, and the truth, now plain for all to see, would remain hidden behind closed doors. By the middle of 1943, evidence had accumulated like storm clouds over Tokyo. Every battlefield, every intercepted signal, every prisoner, every patrol report hinted at a single, terrifying truth: Japan was fighting an enemy far larger and stronger than its intelligence apparatus had ever predicted. Yet this truth had not been officially acknowledged, let alone accepted. It remained fragmented, scattered across documents, desks, and minds like pieces of a puzzle that no one dared assemble. That changed in September 1943, when the Naval General Staff quietly formed a special working group. Their mission was unprecedented, even dangerous: rebuild from the ground up an accurate estimate of American naval manpower, unfiltered by pre-war assumptions, unshaped by institutional pride, and unrestricted by political considerations. Japan's strategic planners did not yet know it, but the report this group would produce, their cold, mathematical assessment of the enemy, would reveal a reality more devastating than any battlefield defeat. It would show that the Pacific War had been lost long before the first Japanese aircraft reached Pearl Harbor. The working group included intelligence analysts, operations planners, logistics officers, and statisticians. These were not junior officers but seasoned men, many with combat experience or advanced training. They were given a rare directive: analyze the evidence, as it is not as the Navy wishes it to be. For the first time since the war began, Japanese analysts were encouraged to think freely, to question entrenched assumptions, and to examine uncomfortable truths. Their task demanded intellectual courage. The implications of their work could shake the foundations of Japan's strategic doctrine. The men began by gathering every scrap of data collected since Pearl Harbor. Submarine reports documenting U.S. task forces, reconnaissance flights over American bays, radio intercepts listing unit identifiers and command structures, POW interrogation transcripts, intelligence supplied by Germany, technical articles from American industry, captured operational manuals, testimonies from merchant sailors, fleet logs from defeated Japanese units. For 6 weeks, the group operated in a quiet room inside the Naval Intelligence Division, doors locked, discussions confidential, the air thick with tension. What they found was staggering. The group began by calculating minimum American personnel needed to crew the ships confirmed to be operating in the Pacific. The math was simple. One fleet carrier required roughly 3,000 men, a battleship, 2,000 to 2,500, a heavy cruiser, 900, a destroyer, 250 to 300. Auxiliary vessels varied, but often numbered in the hundreds. Even using conservative Japanese estimates, which still underestimated American manning standards, the analysts quickly discovered that U.S. forces operating in the Pacific alone required more than 850,000 personnel, but that did not include Atlantic Fleet operations, training bases, shore establishments, naval aviation training commands, the shipbuilding workforce, the merchant marine, stateside logistics personnel, reserve forces, and officer candidates. When these factors were added, the estimate rose to 1.2 million naval personnel. Still, they were not finished. Next, the group incorporated American training rates. They reviewed multiple captured documents describing boot camp capacities, technical school expansion, and mobilization statistics. They included the now infamous POW report, describing Great Lakes Naval Training Center processing 20,000 recruits per month. Then, they reanalyzed German intelligence reports detailing crew sizes observed on American destroyer escorts, each carrying 50% more sailors than Japanese counterparts. This implied that the U.S. manning philosophy relied heavily on redundant engineering teams, expanded damage control units, larger maintenance sections, more extensive communication staff, greater personnel depth for sustained operations. With these adjusted manning ratios applied across the American fleet, the group produced its most alarming calculation: 1.8 million American naval personnel active by mid-1943, with projected growth to 2.4 million by mid-1944. These were conservative numbers. Even so, they were enough to overturn every Japanese strategic assumption. On the morning of the 9th of November, 1943, the working group delivered its report. It was 82 pages long, meticulously footnoted, mathematically precise, and brutally honest. For the first time in the war, Japanese naval leadership held in its hands a comprehensive picture of American strength. The report's conclusions were devastating. Japan had underestimated American naval manpower by at least 300%. The United States could operate simultaneous major offensives in multiple theaters. American losses, ships, planes, personnel, were fully replaceable within weeks. Japan lacked the industrial and human capacity to match U.S. mobilization. The defensive perimeter strategy was obsolete. Decisive battle doctrine was no longer viable. The war could not be won militarily, but the most damning sentence appeared near the end. Japan cannot win a war of attrition against the United States. This single statement invalidated years of war planning, shattered the logic of the first phase of the war, and rendered futile every hope of grinding down American resolve. Japan's entire strategy had been built upon a phantom enemy, an imaginary United States far smaller and weaker than the real one. When senior naval leaders read the report, silence filled the room. No one disputed the data. No one challenged the methodology. The numbers were too clear, the evidence too overwhelming. At last, they understood the truth. The war had been unwinnable from the beginning, but acceptance of this truth was another matter entirely. Admitting the report publicly, or even widely within the Navy, was impossible. The consequences would be catastrophic. Field commanders would lose morale. Government officials would demand answers. The Army would blame the Navy. The Emperor might demand accountability. Public morale could collapse. Naval leadership might be removed. Thus, the report was classified at the highest level. Only 19 officers received full access. Copies were stored in secure safes. References were encrypted. Analysts were instructed not to discuss its conclusions outside the group. On paper, Japan updated some internal planning documents to reflect higher American manpower. In practice, nothing changed. Field commanders continued to operate under outdated assumptions. Strategic planners maintained unrealistic expectations. War operations proceeded as if the report did not exist. Japan had discovered the truth, then buried it. From that point forward, Japanese officers found themselves in a surreal position, privately aware that the war was mathematically unwinnable, yet publicly continuing to speak of decisive victories and strategic turning points. Everything Japan had fought for, every campaign, every operation, every sacrifice had been built on a foundation of inaccurate intelligence. Now that the truth was known, the system chose preservation over transparency. The war machine marched on, fueled not by strategy, but by inertia. Even as the report concluded that American naval strength might reach 2.4 million by mid-1944, reality was already surpassing those projections. By December 1943, just 1 month after the report, the actual number of U.S. naval personnel was 237,4094. The working group's worst-case estimates had already been exceeded. America's mobilization had outpaced even the most pessimistic Japanese recalculations. The Pacific War was no longer a struggle between fleets. It was a struggle between nations, between industrial systems, between manpower pools, between two very different ways of waging war. And Japan could no longer pretend it did not know which side held the advantage. The secret report delivered in November 1943 should have transformed Japan's entire wartime strategy. It should have forced a shift in priorities, compelled a reevaluation of assumptions, and sparked a national reckoning about whether the war could or should continue. Instead, it became one of the most tragic documents in Japanese military history. A revelation accurate enough to expose the truth, yet politically radioactive enough to remain locked in secrecy. While American shipyards thundered day and night and U.S. training centers churned out tens of thousands of new sailors each month, Japan chose silence. Reality was too dangerous to confront, too costly to acknowledge, too destabilizing to admit. And so Japan continued to fight a war already proven unwinnable, fueled by illusions that its own intelligence system had shattered, but its leadership refused to accept. It was not simply a failure of information anymore. It was a failure of courage, politics, and institutional survival. The Japanese Navy had discovered the truth, but it could not bear the consequences of telling it. Senior naval officials who read the report were stunned by its clarity. Many had suspected the estimates were wrong, but none expected the discrepancy to be so vast. They realized, perhaps for the first time, that the strategic framework of the Pacific War, Japan's entire vision of quick victories, defensive perimeters, and negotiated settlement, had been built on numbers that were simply fantasies. Yet, instead of provoking strategic reform, the report provoked fear. If the truth became widely known, fleet morale might collapse. Government officials might question the Navy's competence. The emperor might lose confidence in military leadership. Rivalries between the army and navy might erupt into open conflict. The public might panic or lose faith in ultimate victory. Political leaders might demand negotiation or surrender. The consequences were too explosive. The truth was too heavy. The stakes were too high. And so, the highest levels of the naval command made a fateful decision. The report would be hidden. The Japanese military culture of the time was rigidly hierarchical. Admitting a mistake, especially one so large, was seen as a form of dishonor. Admitting that the war had been launched under fundamentally false assumptions was unthinkable. Leaders feared that the revelation would not merely damage reputations, it could unravel the military structure itself. Responsibility for the miscalculation stretched back years, to intelligence departments that treated analysis as secondary, to operations officers who rejected contradictory evidence, to senior admirals confident in their own strategic models, to political leaders who preferred optimistic intelligence, to cultural assumptions that blinded the nation to enemy capabilities. No single officer could be blamed, but every senior officer feared accountability. Instead of confronting failure, the institution protected itself. The report was given the highest classification. Copies were counted, locked away in safes. Analysts were ordered never to discuss the findings openly. Field commanders were not informed. Japan chose institutional self-preservation over strategic survival. While Tokyo guarded the truth, officers in the field continued fighting under illusions already disproven. Across the Pacific, Japanese commanders were told that American forces were overextended and approaching their manpower limits. They were encouraged to believe that attrition would eventually weaken U.S. resolve. This was no longer misinformation. It was a deliberate choice to let men fight and die, based on assumptions the high command knew were false. At Guadalcanal, Japanese troops had fought to near extinction, believing American supply lines were fragile. At Rabaul, pilots flew against overwhelming odds, believing American air strength was nearing collapse. In the Solomons, destroyer captains engaged superior forces, believing U.S. losses could not be replaced quickly. They were wrong because Tokyo had chosen not to correct them. As American task forces grew in number and strength, field commanders became increasingly confused. They reported more ships than expected, more aircraft, more reinforcements, more logistics vessels. Every message they sent contradicted the official estimates. Every battle they fought exposed the widening gap. Yet Tokyo's response was the same: trust the estimates, not the evidence. Japan's military system relied heavily on the belief that victory was not only possible, but inevitable through courage and fighting spirit. The doctrine of Seishin, spiritual strength, emphasized that determination could overcome material deficits. This belief was not merely philosophical, it was structural. It justified aggressive tactics, desperate offensives, and the refusal to retreat. To undermine this belief with cold numbers would have shaken the foundation of Japan's war effort. The truth was too stark. America had 10 times Japan's manpower. America trained sailors faster than Japan could replace losses. America's shipbuilding capacity exceeded Japan's by a factor of 20. America's ability to wage war was not diminishing, it was exponentially growing. Such revelations could break the psychological backbone of the imperial forces. Leaders feared that soldiers and sailors already fighting with minimal supplies, insufficient reinforcements, and growing exhaustion might lose the will to fight if they knew the real scale of American strength. And so the illusion was maintained, not because it was believed, but because it was necessary. By late 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy was trapped inside a paradox of its own making. It had the truth, but could not share it. It needed change, but could not enact it. It faced defeat, but could not admit it. It was losing the war, but could not retreat. The institution had become its own prisoner, unable to adapt, because adaptation required acknowledging failure. This paralysis guaranteed that Japan would continue fighting a war that could no longer be won, under strategies that no longer matched reality, guided by intelligence that no longer reflected the world. The tragedy was no longer an intelligence failure, it was a failure to accept intelligence. Even as the secret report circulated among the highest ranks, events on the battlefield continued to demonstrate its accuracy. In November 1943, the same month, the report was delivered. American forces launched attacks in the Gilberts, the first step in the Central Pacific Campaign. Japan expected a measured assault. Instead, American carrier groups appeared in overwhelming numbers, backed by logistics fleets so large that Japanese observers could not fathom the manpower behind them. Every battle from that point forward, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Peleliu, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, would reveal the same truth. The American war machine was unstoppable because its manpower base was effectively limitless. And still, Tokyo said nothing. In burying the report, Japan effectively sealed its fate. The war was no longer being lost on the battlefield. It was being lost in conference rooms, inside locked safes, and behind closed doors where truths were hidden and illusions protected. The Pacific War was a tragedy of numbers, yes, but, more profoundly, it was a tragedy of pride. A nation trapped by its own refusal to see the world as it was. Japan did not lose because it fought poorly. Japan lost because, when confronted with the truth, it chose silence. By early 1944, the Pacific Ocean had transformed into a vast arena where the true scale of American power could no longer be hidden, denied, or rationalized. The illusions that had guided Japanese strategy for years were collapsing under the weight of cold, undeniable reality. Carrier decks filled the horizon. Logistics convoys stretched farther than binoculars could see. Airfields bristled with aircraft, each supported by teams of mechanics, armorers, radiomen, and logisticians large enough to rival entire Japanese squadrons. The truth was no longer a matter of intelligence. It was visible to every sailor, every pilot, every officer. America was fighting the war on a scale Japan had never imagined and never prepared for. And yet, none of this was surprising. Japan had received the warnings. Japan had conducted the analysis. Japan had even documented the truth in the secret November 1943 report. But the system had chosen silence, and silence, not ignorance, became Japan's downfall. In January 1944, American shipyards launched more tonnage in a single month than Japan had launched in an entire year. New Essex-class carriers appeared faster than Japan could sink them. Destroyers rolled out of factories by the dozen. Submarines slipped into the Pacific at a pace that made Japanese countermeasures irrelevant. And behind each ship stood crews well-fed, well-trained, and numerically overwhelming. Japan, meanwhile, struggled to replace even basic losses. Where America had abundance, Japan had scarcity. Where America built new fleets, Japan patched old hulls. Where America trained thousands, Japan trained dozens. The manpower imbalance had reached a scale beyond strategy. It had become a law of nature, vast, inescapable, and crushing. The assault on the Marshall and Mariana Islands in 1944 demonstrated the full consequence of Japan's intelligence failure. American task forces assembled for these operations were not simply large, they were unprecedented in naval history. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Americans deployed 15 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, 69 destroyers, over 70,000 personnel. To put that in perspective, the entire Imperial Japanese Navy at the start of the war had barely exceeded 400,000 personnel, including shore establishments, training schools, and administrative staff. The Americans had committed 1/6 of their total naval manpower to a single battle, and they still maintained full-scale operations in the Atlantic and other regions. Japan had never imagined such scale because its intelligence assumptions had made it impossible to imagine. The working group's revised numbers, conservative though they were, paled against the reality revealed in the Philippine Sea. There, in the skies north of the Marianas, the Imperial Navy's elite air arm was annihilated. 450 aircraft were lost in a single day, along with the irreplaceable pilots who flew them. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For Japan, it was the death of the Naval Air Force, and when the smoke cleared, The Americans suffered just 29 aircraft losses. Japan could not replace its losses. America replaced theirs in hours. Throughout 1,944 and 1,945, every Japanese commander felt the inescapable weight of manpower disparity. Japanese pilots fought against American air groups that never seemed to shrink. Japanese sailors watched American convoys arrive with overwhelming supplies. Japanese Marines faced waves of U.S. troops, backed by logistics chains, measured not in ships but in armadas. Japan's most skilled officers began openly acknowledging the truth among themselves. It was no longer a war between fleets. It was a war between nations, and Japan was the smaller nation in every measurable way. Every Japanese loss was permanent. Every American loss was temporary. Every Japanese victory was fleeting. Every American victory was compounded by resources Japan could not match. By mid-1944, even the most loyal naval officers could not deny that the war's outcome was mathematically inevitable. The numbers had written Japan's destiny long before the first American soldiers stepped foot in the Pacific. Japan's strategic doctrine, particularly its faith in the decisive battle, was built on the idea that a single, overwhelming victory could change the course of the war. But decisive battles only matter when armies and navies are evenly matched. Against the United States, Japan was never matched. It believed it was fighting on a narrow front. Instead, it was fighting a global industrial empire. It believed the enemy would tire. Instead, the enemy grew stronger. It believed losses would weaken the Americans. Instead, losses motivated them. Japan had entered a war of attrition against the one nation on Earth best equipped to fight and win a war of attrition. The tragedy was not that Japan lacked bravery or skill. The tragedy was that bravery and skill could not alter arithmetic. Every Japanese ship lost after 1943, every aircraft shot down, every young pilot who flew a final mission, every sailor who never returned home, all of them were casualties, not merely of battle, but of assumptions made years earlier in rooms where numbers were misread and warnings ignored. Pilots who believed reinforcements were on the way never understood why replacements never came. Captains who believed American fleets were nearing collapse did not know the real numbers had been locked away. Soldiers who fought to exhaustion did so believing a final victory was possible. They were fighting for illusions carefully preserved by leadership who feared the consequences of truth. This is the deepest tragedy of all. Japan did not lose because its warriors failed. Japan lost because its leaders could not see. By the time Japan formally surrendered on the 2nd of September 1945, the American Navy had grown to 3,380,000 personnel, 16 fleet carriers, hundreds of destroyers and escorts, dozens of battleships and cruisers, over 50,000 aircraft. Meanwhile, Japan's navy, once among the world's most formidable, had fewer than 300,000 remaining personnel and only a handful of operational ships. The pre-war estimate of American naval manpower, 296,000, remained one of the greatest intelligence failures in modern history. The actual numbers had exceeded predictions by nearly eightfold. Japan did not simply miscalculate an enemy, it miscalculated an entire civilization. And because that miscalculation went uncorrected, undisclosed, and unacknowledged, it condemned the nation to a war it could not win. The Pacific War was not decided by tactics or heroism or even strategy. It was decided by numbers Japan had access to, but could not understand. Numbers that spoke louder than admirals, numbers that shattered empires, numbers that ended the war before it began.